Hello and welcome to this video on hormone balance. If you're watching this video, then you're getting to know your causes questionnaire, and my message to you in week 1 will have indicated that your hormone balance might be playing a role in your histamine intolerance. So today what we're going to cover is how hormone balance can be linked with histamine intolerance. Then we're going to talk more specifically about estrogen, so the female sex hormone, and cortisol, our stress hormone. At the end, I'll give you some ideas of tests you can do to see how hormones might be impacting your histamine intolerance, and I'll also go over what you can do over the next couple of weeks to start to address any hormonal issues that could be contributing to your histamine intolerance. First of all, how do histamine intolerance and hormone balance link? Histamine promotes the release of some of our sex hormones as women, estradiol, prolactin, and LH. That's called luteinizing hormone and plays an important role in our menstrual cycle. And estrogen also makes histamine more impactful. That means the higher up the estrogen levels in our body, the more our cells respond to the signals of histamine. So when we have lower levels of histamine, the same amount of histamine might cause less symptoms as it does when we have higher levels of estrogen. That's why women often have increases in their symptoms at certain parts of their cycle, because where the estrogen levels are higher, so for example during ovulation, they tend to feel worse. So if you're one of those women that's always wondered, why does everybody say that it's so great during ovulation, I feel horrible when I ovulate, that might be because estrogen is actually making your histamine intolerance symptoms worse, and that can affect your mood, your energy levels, your comfort levels, all sorts of things. Many women notice improvements during pregnancy because estrogen levels are lowered during pregnancy, and our body produces more DAO because the placenta produces huge quantities of DAO. So that means many women with histamine intolerance can suddenly tolerate lots of foods that they normally can't during pregnancy, which is really useful when all those cravings hit. Moving on from sex hormones, histamine also promotes the release of our stress hormones, and the one that we'll be talking about in particular today is cortisol. So you can see here, histamine increases the release of estrogen, but also estrogen increases the impact of histamine. And at the top, we'll be talking about how the circadian rhythm and our arousal, so all these stress hormones, can be impacted by histamine as well. So, estrogen. Estrogen matters when we have an estrogen dominance. So that means we have a relative dominance of estrogen in comparison to our other sex hormones like progesterone. Or if we just have comparatively high estrogen levels compared to what it should normally be. And it can be a cause of histamine intolerance. So if you have a condition like endometriosis, which is associated with high estrogen levels, that can cause your issues with histamine. But because histamine also promotes the release of estrogen, if your histamine intolerance is out of control or very severe, that can be causing your estrogen levels to rise, and that might cause estrogen dominance for you. How do you know if you have estrogen dominance? You'll have one or more a pattern of these symptoms. So you'll have a lower libido, your periods will be probably irregular or just maybe stronger, there might be more clotting, they might go on for longer. So something about them isn't that typical 4 to 7 days, manageable pain levels, manageable flow. Bloating and water retention are very big symptoms. Breast swelling and tenderness, fibrocystic breasts, so if you tend to get cysts in your breast, that can also be a sign. Headaches, particularly when they're related to your cycle. Mood swings, weight and fat gain, particularly around your middle and your hips. So if you're noticing maybe you have quite skinny legs or quite skinny arms, or whenever you gain weight, first of all, it starts in the middle. That's often a sign that that's estrogen causing the storage. Endometriosis, like I mentioned before. Cold hands and feet, hair loss, thyroid dysfunction is very linked. So if you've got issues with your thyroid, then it's worth also having a look at your estrogen levels. A slower metabolism, foggy thinking, memory loss, fatigue, trouble sleeping, PMS, and painful periods. So it's a long list, but these symptoms often come together as a picture. So if you've just got headaches or you've just got fatigue, that's probably not a sign of estrogen dominance. But if you've got a few of these symptoms coming together, you notice that there is a kind of cyclical pattern there, then it's probably worth considering estrogen dominance as a possible cause or contributor to your histamine intolerance. So how do we get rid of estrogen? What happens is our body produces estrogen, and nowadays we also take in quite a bit of estrogen because our water is contaminated with hormonal contraceptive. We take hormonal contraceptives, we take HRT. There are things that affect our estrogen levels in plastic and self-care products. So we have the stuff we produce, we have the stuff we take in. The body should use that, and then it breaks it down into what we call metabolites, so breakdown products, and then it gets rid of that through your stool. Now, the body can break down the estrogen into kind of neutral or beneficial breakdown products, or it can break the estrogen down into less helpful breakdown products, which actually have an even stronger estrogenic effect than the estrogen itself does, or that can have negative effects on our health. So they might, for example, be carcinogenic. So when we're talking about estrogen metabolism, we want to make sure your estrogen is being broken down into the right breakdown product and that it's then passing out through your stool. And the first step of that is making sure that your stool is taking the estrogen out. If you're not having regular bowel movements, broken down estrogen, whether it's in the right format or the wrong format, will sit in your gut and be reabsorbed and recirculated. So suddenly you've got what your body's producing, what you're taking in, and what your body's trying to get rid of, all affecting your body. So if you've got constipation, this is one of the first things you'll need to address. And actually the next steps shouldn't be done until your constipation is addressed. So some good tips for that include making sure you're having enough fiber every day. So that should be 30 grams. And you can actually use your food journal on Practice Better to keep track of what you're eating to see whether you're reaching those 30 grams. Making sure you're drinking enough, so 2 liters a day or 8 glasses of water at least, and you're not having too much caffeine because that's dehydrating. You can try some particular forms of fiber like psyllium husk, but with this one you have to be very careful that you're drinking enough. Stewed apples, prunes, kiwi. You need to be moving every day, at least a half-hour walk every day. And if it's very severe, you can consider abdominal massage, so just kind of gently rubbing your stomach in a clockwise direction, maybe lying on your bed listening to something soothing or a nice podcast. For a few minutes, just give your stomach that rub, because what's happening is we get food into our gut and then it sits there. And then it's muscle movement that makes the food move through the gut. So when we're moving or when we're massaging our guts or when we're stretching, those movements around the gut help to push the food through the system as it should be pushed. You want to reduce your exposure to external estrogens, so that's plastics, pesticides, and personal care products in particular. So avoid using plastic water bottles and plastic Tupperware. Avoid foods with pesticides, so try to choose organic where possible, particularly when you're having milk. And then personal care products, just make sure you don't have many parabens, things like that. See what you can switch out for more natural options. If you're on hormonal contraception, talk to your GP about non-hormonal options and just consider that. But it might be worth testing your hormone levels first before doing this. Avoid non-coffee sources of caffeine. So that's things like Coke, Pepsi, energy drinks, all these kinds of less natural sources of caffeine, because they really promote estrogen dominance. Coffee, this is the good news, on the other hand, promotes your estrogen being metabolized down the helpful pathway. So coffee is okay. Non-coffee sources of caffeine should be excluded. Minimize your alcohol intake. This really promotes estrogen dominance, and that's why you see men who drink a lot of alcohol often having man boobs, things like that, because their estrogen production is even being boosted. So for you, if you have estrogen dominance problems, really try to minimize your alcohol intake. And then make sure you have sufficient magnesium, folate, choline, and zinc. So these are all important nutrients. We'll talk about them a bit more next week, but you can also find out from your sheet where and what these nutrients are. And then another thing that I would always recommend is working one-to-one with a practitioner to identify your personal root causes. So if you've got an estrogen dominance, that's not come from nowhere. It might be genetic, you might see some things in your family going back, but you really want to go to the bottom of that and address those root causes, just like we're doing with the histamine intolerance. Some extra tips of things you can do if you've got estrogen dominance is start eating raw, organic, and unpeeled carrots. So you want the whole carrot, because in the skin of the carrot, you find a lot of really helpful fiber called pectin, which first of all feeds our good gut bacteria, which is always helpful, but it also really helps to push the estrogen through the gut so that there's less opportunity for it to be reabsorbed by your body. You also want to be eating dark chocolate. Yes, I'm recommending dark chocolate in small amounts because of histamine, of course. But dark chocolate is a really good source of magnesium, and it helps to transport the estrogen away from one detox stage to another, so we're getting it down the right pathway. This one is, of course, a little bit mean because some of you might not be able to tolerate dark chocolate, but what you can try is purchase raw cacao powder, which has not been fermented. So that might be better tolerated by those of us with histamine intolerance. Now, moving on from estrogen to cortisol. Cortisol, like I mentioned at the beginning, is our stress hormone, but it also has many other important functions. So it's not just bad. We actually need cortisol to be able to function properly, because cortisol is what keeps us awake, basically. It makes us alert, and then when the levels drop, it helps us to sleep at night. So you can see on this diagram that there is 3 different patterns that we might see. We can also see something far more dysregulated than this, but just to keep things simple. So ideally what you want to see is this gray dotted line where you wake up. Within 30 minutes, you have your highest cortisol of the day. And then from then on, it drops down so that it's nice and low in the evening when you're trying to go to sleep. So what that means is in the morning, as soon as the light hits your eyes, your cortisol levels start to rise, and they help you to get out of bed, feel awake, feel motivated, feel ready for the day. Then as the day goes on, those levels will come down, and in the evening, when the levels are very low, you'll feel sleepy, you'll feel tired, and you'll be able to go to sleep well. If in the mornings your cortisol spikes too much, you wake up with this kind of very stressy, anxious, flustered feeling. If it's too low, you might be struggling to get out of bed, you might be feeling really tired and sluggish in the mornings, you might need coffee to get going, all these kinds of things. And actually what I very often see is even more dysregulated patterns than this, where maybe the cortisol is low in the morning. It starts where it should be at night, and then in the evening it comes up. Or it's already high, and then during the day it keeps coming up again because people are having stressful events during the day, or they're having coffee, which actually increases our cortisol, and so on. So there's an ideal way that our cortisol should look, and there's not ideal ways, many not ideal ways. To know whether your cortisol is dysregulated, you might be feeling tired and sluggish when you wake up. You might take more than half an hour to get going in the mornings. You might need caffeine and other stimulants to get you going or keep you going. You might feel suddenly awake in the evening, so we call that a second wind. So that's people who are feeling really tired throughout the day or in the afternoon, and then it's 10 p.m. you want to go to bed, and suddenly, pling, you're awake. And that's maybe when you catch up on tasks, you do lots of things, and then you end up going to bed really late. Struggling to fall asleep at night or waking up frequently throughout the night, so sleep disturbances are often associated with a dysregulated cortisol rhythm. Unexplained weight gain, mood swings, feeling stressed and constantly alert, IBS, so stomach problems, cravings, and muscle aches. So all those might be signs that your cortisol rhythm is slightly dysregulated. And what happens when we have a dysregulated cortisol rhythm is that promotes Th2 dominance. Now, if you haven't watched the immune balance video, the Th2 system is a part of our immune system that's involved in allergic responses. And allergies are associated with histamine. So the more active our Th2 system is, the more responsive we are to histamine, and the more likely we are to produce histamine. So when our cortisol is all over the place, we might have much more responsive Th2 system, which means we're likely to produce more histamine and be more responsive to things that could trigger histamine. And then when we have high levels of histamine, that actually promotes cortisol production. So if you've been struggling with histamine intolerance for a really long time, if your histamine intolerance is severe, it's quite likely that your cortisol levels are a little bit out of whack. And then we get into another vicious cycle where histamine promotes Th2, which promotes histamine production, and then that promotes cortisol, which promotes Th2, and so on. So what do we do to regulate that rhythm? To help your body get back into a natural rhythm, you can make sure you're living in line with the circadian clock. So the circadian clock is something where in each of our cells, there's a natural signal of when it should be awake and when it should be asleep. So that means when it should be more active and less active. So if we're thinking about our digestive system, there are times of day when our gallbladder is better producing bile, our stomach is better at producing acid, our pancreas is better at producing digestive enzymes. So when those things are more active and better at doing things, it's a better time to eat because we'll be better able to digest. And if we're eating at times where all of those things are not really working, they're kind of sleeping, then what we eat will not be so well digested and will cause issues. And so for us, the natural rhythm is really following the daylight patterns around the equator. So say from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. is kind of our natural waking and eating window. And then from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., that should be kind of that wind down, rest, no more eating period. So what you want to be doing is eat during the day, don't eat at night. Make sure you're exposed to bright lights during the day and particularly in the morning. And then at night, you want to be dimming the lights and have total darkness when you're sleeping. You want to be moving during the day and avoiding movement or intense movement at night. So you can see those are kind of the opposites. Eat light and movement during the daytime, and then don't eat darkness and dim lights and less movement during the nighttime. You want to address anxious thoughts. So if you know that you're a bit of a stress head, you're a worrier, then watch the stress video, first of all, but also consider taking a CBT or mindfulness approach and maybe working with someone one-to-one on that. Address stress, already mentioned that. Do regular deep breathing exercises. So we talk about that more in the stress video again, but that really helps to turn off the stress system. So if you think your cortisol levels might be quite high, or if they're quite high in the evenings, to get those down, deep breathing exercises can be really helpful. Spend time in nature, make sure you're moving regularly. Have a diet rich in complex carbohydrates. So often we try to cut out carbohydrates when we're trying to be healthy, but that can actually bring our cortisol rhythm out of whack. So just make sure you're having complex carbohydrates, which are your whole grains, your vegetables, your fruits, your nuts and seeds. And you want to avoid sugar and refined carbohydrates. So refined carbohydrates are your white flour, white pasta, white rice, all those kinds of things. Now you can test this. So there is this Dutch panel, and the more complete, so the lower you go down this list, the more things are being tested, but the same system is used. So you can either find out about your cortisol only, or you can find out about your sex hormones only, or you can find out about your cortisol and sex hormones, or you can find out about your cortisol, your sex hormones, and your cortisol awakening response, which is that spike that I mentioned in the morning, and it's a good indicator of general health. If you have issues with estrogen dominance or you suspect those, I would also recommend a comprehensive stool test, because that can give us an idea of how well your body is excreting the estrogen. And then we know, okay, maybe, yes, it's a hormone imbalance, but we need to be focusing on your gut to help your body get rid of the estrogen. That's what's causing the problems. So what you need to do this week is get in touch with me if you'd like to explore one of those tests. There's more information on the tests on this week's immune balance handout, so you can have a look at that. Hormone balance handout. And of course, read the hormone balance handout and mark any changes that you'll make over the coming weeks. You can find those questionnaires and handouts by scrolling down underneath this week's videos. Just scroll down to the bottom of the module page and you'll see it there. I wish you joy and health, and I look forward to seeing you on Friday.